Welcome to the Relationship Series podcast. My name is Ankush Jain, and each episode I'll be speaking to a different state of mind expert on the subject of relationships. Enjoy. Welcome to episode 35 of the Relationship Series. This podcast, I'm joined by a good friend, Terry Rubenstein. She's the director of the Innate Health Centre in London, working in the field of state of mind for over a decade, and she works globally through seminars, conferences, groups, and one-to-one work. She's got a new book out, which is out in April 2016, called Exquisite Mind, and I'm looking forward to having her on the podcast today to talk about a couple of things, including parenting, which I'm very excited to talk to her about. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's begin like I begin all my podcasts, which is really tell us a little bit about yourself. How is it that you became, I guess, an expert, someone who works globally in this very niche world around state of mind?
Well, Ankush, doing this work is the last thing I thought I'd ever do. Like, I know a lot of people have aspirations to be in the helping field and to be life coaches or psychologists. That wasn't what I wanted to do. And I guess the reason was because I didn't feel like I had the answers myself. I felt that I struggled psychologically in my own life. I felt that life was difficult. It was tough. I worked really, really hard to kind of be in life the way that I wanted to be in life. And I felt almost that life was too big for me. So the thought of kind of helping other people to have more ease and grace in life was an anomaly to me. Like, I didn't feel I had much to offer. So this was not an aspiration of mine. It was rather an unfolding of life and where I found myself, which was really surprising to me. Just to kind of sum it up, I struggled a lot in my early years and teenage years and also early 20s with anxiety and depression. They came and went. I mean, there were times in my life that at least on the superficial level, it looked like I was really doing well. I got married to a fantastic guy. I had a lot of little kids. I excelled in school academically. I was kind of like the head girl in my school. And so superficially, as success looks, I guess, to all of us in the Western world, it looked like I was a good role model of that. But in my internal world, I suffered with what I guess people, I don't know if they still call it this these days, low self-esteem. I had eating disorders. I had a lot of self-harm tendencies. I suffered with suicidal thoughts, and I battled. There was like this interesting dynamic where there were times that I felt like life was okay and I could actually show up and live it. And there were times where I felt so overwhelmed by life that it just felt like if I could just close my eyes and go into some kind of deep coma, that would be a good thing. So this was kind of the struggle that I went through until the age of 29, where up until then, there were little kind of methods that I used to get me over my struggle. So I would go for some therapy and I'd take a little bit of medication, and it seemed to kind of just get me through the worst of the kind of the darkness that I was struggling against. But at the age of 28, I think it was, I had my fifth child and I'd immigrated. My eldest was actually 6.5. I had these 5 little boys under the age of 6.5. And I just had what I guess people would call a breakdown. And I went into what I've kind of termed the Great Depression, because this depression didn't feel like the other depressions. They almost just felt like flirtations with depression. This felt like the real deal. And I was absolutely 100% convinced that I'd never get out of this. I tried my usual kind of meds and went for therapy, and nothing helped. I got really, really desperate and low, and I came to a point where I didn't want to live. And I was very, very impulsive at the time, very, very desperate. And I was actually I'm actually very, very blessed to be alive today, to be to be talking to you. I didn't have any resources left to kind of draw on. Everything that I knew had kind of brought me to this dark, dark period and wasn't helping me. And I think one of the turning points for me at the time, there were many turning points, too many to talk about, but within my own mind, I realized that I needed to look outside of what I knew. I needed to look to something, there was something outside of what Terry Rubenstein understood about how to be in life that was invisible to me and that was visible to other people. Because I looked around and I saw that people's circumstances were challenging and they were, they were going through the same things that I was, but yet they were doing better. Somehow it felt like living was more natural to them than it was to me. And I was reading a lot of books at the time of different people's struggles in life, be it people who'd crashed in the Andes or who had been through torture camps or had suffered abuse or had been through eating disorders. I was reading a lot of those books, and what started to intrigue me was that every person had a different story. They had a different background, they had different educations, they had different personalities, they had different life circumstances. But there was something common to all of them, almost like a common thread, which I kind of termed at that time as the human spirit, which seemed to do something for them, and they had some kind of transformation. And I was interested in that human spirit. I was interested in that kind of common thread, and I was interested to see if that was true for me too. So I was curious about that. And I think I was, for the first time in my life, really humble. Like, I would have said that I'm a humble person because I had a low self-esteem, and I thought that meant you were humble if you didn't like yourself. I thought people who were confident were arrogant, and people like me were humble. But yet, I was so full of ego because I thought about myself 24/7. Not good things about myself, but I was so obsessed with how I was doing. And there was a way in which this depression humbled me. I was tired of thinking about myself. I wasn't interested anymore in what I knew. And so all these there were a couple of things that came together. And there was this moment in my life where, at my absolute worst, most desperate point, I'd just come out of hospital. I'd been hospitalized for a few days. I decided to just try something different. I decided to come off the meds. I was on a lot of meds at that stage, and see if I could find this health in me, this human spirit, see if I could find a different path forward. It was like almost a crossroads, and everything, if you look at socially and medically, what was responsible for me to do at that stage was almost to hand myself over to the medical doctors and, maybe spend some time in a clinic or go on stronger meds. But I looked in a different direction. I looked within me, and I had what I'd call an insight or an intuition that I couldn't go against, that just kind of said, go off the meds and see if you can find the health within you. And I did that. And there was a 6-month period where, I'm not going to lie, it was a roller coaster. It wasn't like I just suddenly, kind of felt better. But I started to get glimpses of my own health. I started to feel better, and I started to think, how's it possible that in the midst of kind of a hurricane, you can feel peaceful? How's it possible for a human being to feel peaceful, even if it's only for 5 seconds, when surrounding those moments you've been feeling so bad? Like, where does that potential lie? Like, where does it come from, and how does it disappear? I was really curious. Anyhow, to cut a long story short, when these 6 months were over, I felt like a different person. I got to the end of this 6-month period, and I just felt different. I was different. It's almost like I just fell in love with myself. but not myself as the identity of Terry. It's like I met this deeper essence that had nothing to do with my good points, my bad points, things I wanted to change, my weight, my looks, my intelligence. It was much deeper below the surface of that. And it was that essence of what I think, and I've come to understand, makes us human. And the interesting thing for me was that when I touched that and connected with that, I felt this love for everybody around me in a different way than I'd felt before, for my kids and for my friends and for just strangers, like people I'd bump into. It was just like this connection with life that was very simple. It was deep, but it wasn't weird or spiritual. It just felt very light and very simple. And everything in my life from that point onwards seemed to simplify. Everything that looked complicated and difficult and had taken so much effort just almost simplified, and I felt so much lighter. Now, I had no idea what had happened to me. At this stage, I knew nothing about state of mind or thought or how feeling worked or anything like that. I just knew that I felt different, and I felt the only way I could describe it at that time is I felt like life was moving through me rather than coming at me. I had the sense of what you call that. I felt empowered. I felt the sense of freedom coming, almost like rushing through my system. And it was about 1.5 years after that, after kind of living in this new state, and just loving life, every moment of life. Even the winter in London, I'd be driving in the grey, miserable weather and thinking, this is just amazing. It was a little bit Pollyanna-ish at that stage, but it was great. I'm not going to complain. Anyhow, I happened to, and I think this is very true to when you're in almost the unfolding of life, things just seem to have a flow to them. And I happened to meet Shal Rosenblatt, who was speaking about kind of state of mind and these fundamental workings of human beings at a real principle level, at a real human level. He was talking about this human spirit and how to capture it and how it works and how we can lose sight of it in a class. He'd happened to come back from a conference in Milwaukee where Dr. Bill Paddock and Judy Sedgman, who are two teachers in this field of state of mind, were presenting a talk, and he was really taken by it. So he was talking to this group of women about these ideas, and I literally sat at the back of the class and I cried. I mean, I didn't make a spectacle of myself. I cried kind of quietly to myself because I was so touched by what he was saying. I knew that what he's saying was true, and I knew that I now had the words to articulate what I had found in myself. And from the moment I found the words, it was like all the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. I understood how I'd been able to change, why life was so much easier for me. And I knew that people didn't need to suffer. I knew that there was something so simple that they could learn to help them. And I knew that I now had a way to articulate this. So it was almost a no-brainer that I would start to share this with people. And Charles and I spoke about it afterwards, and we decided to start talking about these ideas with people in a very informal way. There was nobody at the time in the UK talking about these ideas. They were quite new. People were sharing cognitive behavioral therapy and NLP were kind of prevalent at that time. And what was amazing is that we started to see people get really affected by the ideas we were sharing. They started to really experience change. They loved the ideas. And out of that, the interest and the momentum grew until 2 years ago, I kind of said to Shal, let's establish a center where we can just really use it as a resource center for people to come and learn about state of mind and learn about how they are set up to function psychologically well in life, and they have all the resources they need, and what actually gets in the way of that process, which to me is just a whole bunch of misunderstandings. But those can have quite devastating impacts, as they did for me. And that's what I've been doing ever since. So...
yeah, that's quite a story, Terry. And I didn't know all of that myself, even though we've met before. And what really struck me as you were talking, the first thing that struck me was meeting you, someone who's met you relatively recently. It would never come across that you'd been someone who'd been through, depression and anxiety and eating disorders. It probably doesn't do it justice. People can't see you on this podcast, but it doesn't do it justice that you seem very well put together, because there is a sense of well-being and calmness about you. And just that, I think that potentially gives a lot of hope to people, if anyone's listening to this who's going through their own struggles, of what is possible. And I think that's what a lot of people I've spoke to who have experience around state of mind see that, and they share with me that if they can do it, anyone can do it.
100%. And it's so interesting, because I was speaking to the husband yesterday of a client who's been through really pretty tough stuff. She's been through depression and psychosis. And he walked out of the session with me, and his wife walked in afterwards, and they passed each other in the corridor. And he said to me, she said to me that he said, "There's no way Terry suffered from depression." So it's just funny, because when you're in a space where you feel so vibrant and connected to life and to life's kind of forces and goodness and health, it's hard for people to imagine that you could have been so desperate and struggling so much. But, that's the human condition. Both are available to us. So.
Yeah, and I really want to kind of give a shout out. Normally we do this at the end, but just the great work that you and Shoal, we had Shoal on a previous episode, that you guys are doing in London. And if anyone is in the area and can get there, really do check them out, and we'll give the details at the end of the podcast. One thing I wanted to pick on, there was so much stuff that you talked about there that we could dive into, but one thing I really wanted to pick out, which was really interesting, was when you talked about humility and what real humility is versus ego. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, here's the funny thing, and again, we learn so much. We pick up all these beliefs and truths sometimes from the environment that we live in. And I kind of grew up in a house where nobody seemed to like themselves very much. We all had a lot of self-conscious thinking, and we all lived with a lot of anxiety as a result, because when you kind of rate yourself so low and you feel like you're so incapable, it feels like there's no way that I'm capable of dealing with all the stuff that could come my way, all the challenges that life can throw at me. So you'll often find people, what I've seen, who have what you call a low self-esteem, have a lot of anxiety too, because they're not aware of the capabilities and the intelligence that they have available to them to cope with life. So this was the interesting thing, that I equated the fact that I felt badly about myself with the fact that I was humble. I thought that meant that I was humble. But the truth is, to me, humility, what I've learned now, is when I'm not in the picture. As soon as Terry's center stage in the picture, there's only space for one person. Humility is the space where I just kind of melt into the bigness of life. What you could call it, if you wanted to be really dramatic, the oneness of life. But it's almost when Terry becomes part of humanity. I see myself as just part of humanity, showing up the best that I can with what I know in the moment. And I'm just in the space of learning and seeing. But as soon as I start to operate as if life's about me, and I'm thinking and relating to life through the lens of Terry, so there's a lot of self-conscious thinking. There's a lot of thinking about how Terry views life and what Terry thinks about life and what she thinks about herself. When you do that as well, you don't leave room for what you don't know. You're constantly relating to the world with what you do know. I know this, and this is how life looks to me, and this is how, I used to think, for an example, that I couldn't do better because I had a certain personality. I thought of myself as a person who's intense and who's impulsive, and who's kind of has these I'm extreme in my moods. I had myself limited like that. And that's ego. That was made up. That's made up thinking that I attached myself to. And because of that, I couldn't learn anything new because I thought that was true. So as soon as you think something's true, your ego tells you something's true, you limit yourself. When you start to see, I don't know, it looks this way to me, but maybe there's something else, like what else? And you start to get curious and look outside of your kind of known mind, all the information you have, everything you've built up as your kind of little thought system or belief system. You start to look outside of that, you get really surprised by what you see. It's like there's this whole world of knowledge, what I call kind of true knowledge, that is not within Terry's intellect and Terry's memories and Terry's experiences of life. And it was just so interesting to me that when I fired myself. I almost made myself redundant. I was like, you have no role and no say anymore. What I did was I almost stepped outside of all my self-conscious thinking and all my thinking about myself, myself about myself and myself in relation to the world around me. It's almost like I quietened that down, that all quietened down. And then what showed up was this whole new world of seeing life, not through Terry's own kind of egoic lens, but through a lens that was just, I guess you could call it a universal lens, a human lens. I just started to have thinking about life that was impersonal. It wasn't personal to me. It didn't have Terry's flavor and Terry's take on things. It wasn't that kind of familiar thinking that the ego has. Like my ego thinking is very, very familiar. I know it. It's my, you could call it your kind of inner conversation. And this was just so different. And what was so interesting to me, Ankush, is that when I touched into this kind of thinking, which was beyond what I already knew, there was such a confidence that came with it. But the confidence wasn't arrogance because it had nothing to do with me. It wasn't like I said, it wasn't anything personal to me. It was just a confidence that as human beings, we have a potential to be in life with a lot of clarity and a lot of common sense and a lot of connection and feeling. So it was almost a confidence that wasn't personal to me. It was just a human quality that I kind of stumbled into. So all these things were so surprising to me because I would have said to you that confident people are kind of arrogant and people who don't like themselves are humble. And I got that all upside down in a way. So that's been a big learning for me.
Yeah, that's something that I've not really heard, or if other people have said it, I've not really picked it up before. And it really hit me when you said that, because I see that so true with my own self. That when I was younger and perhaps had less confidence, that I thought that was humility, but it wasn't, because I was always thinking about myself. How did I come across? What would I say? It's so true. When we were talking the other day on the pre-interview, and we were talking, this whole podcast is around relationship. You really want to talk about relationship to yourself. Again, it really struck me when we spoke that you said that's the kind of the primary relationship. And everything else is a reflection of that. I really loved it. I loved that you said that, and it really occurred to me again that that's so true, but I perhaps wouldn't have verbalized it myself in that way.
Well, I guess what's been so interesting to me is that every time I've kind of shifted in my relationship to myself, I've seen the impact in that, in the relationships in my life. I've seen the impact in the relationships in my work life, in my relationship to my husband, and a million times over in relationship to my kids. So, there's so many different examples of this, but even if you take me back 10 years to when I had this kind of life change, one of the things that happened is that I softened in my relationship to myself. So before I was so hard and so critical and so judgmental of myself. It was like nothing that I did was good enough, and everything was, it was almost this perfect me that I was constantly striving for. And of course, I wasn't getting there because there's no such concept. Like that's one of the things I learned, is that the perfection that we're looking for is inside of us. It's already there. We are whole to start with. So looking for a perfect me was just ridiculous. So because it was almost like setting myself up to fail, I was constantly feeling bad and guilty and criticizing myself. I had a very hard experience of myself. And that was reflected into my other relationships. So, as much as people often say, yeah, I'm hard on myself, but I'm really nice to my kids, or, I have a tough time being compassionate to myself, but I can do it to other people. That's, to me, true superficially. But at a real fundamental level, you'll start to see that what's true for you in the way you relate to yourself will ripple out into your other relationships, even if it's more subtle. So there was a way in which I had expectations of myself, and I had expectations of my kids. I wasn't okay to just be me in the world, right? And as I kind of softened and I got more comfortable with myself, and I came to see that the essence of who I was whole and perfect and intact. It's like my entire thinking around myself just softened. And as that happened, my thinking towards my husband and my kids just softened. I started to drop the expectations I had of them to be different to how they were. This whole concept of unconditional love, that I would have said to you, of course I unconditionally love my kids. Of course I do. They're my kids. I'm like mad about them. That was 100% not true, not in how I define unconditional love. Because I was conditional in terms of how I was relating to myself. I could only love myself if I was achieving certain things, performing in certain things, showing up in a certain way, right? And when I didn't, I felt disappointed in myself. I was upset with myself. And that was true because there was a core understanding of mine. That was how I understood how love worked. That was how I was loving in the world. It was how I was loving my husband and my kids. It was like my kids, if you had interviewed one of my children and they were really behaving so-called badly, right? And you said, do you think mommy loves you as much when you're like this or when you're like really being good? They would have 100% no, she loves me much more when I'm being good. They would have picked that up. That to me is a litmus test. Ask people, like, do you feel that our love is completely balanced and there and available in equal measure when you're showing up in this way or that way? Do you think mom really feels the same? Kids, because they're so honest, would have said, for sure not. She's frustrated with me here. I can feel it. I don't feel the love. She might say she loves me, but I don't feel it. And I realized that I was conditional to myself and I was conditional to others. And when I kind of dropped that, when I fell into a more unconditional space where I just gave myself so much more compassion and I saw myself in a different way, and I saw kind of the potential of who I was and got so much more interested in that rather than the kind of human frailties that I was exhibiting in everyday life, that's how I started to relate to my kids. So I started to relate to their potential. I started to see that as human beings, we're doing the best we can in every moment, and if we could do better, we would. And that as soon as we start to beat ourselves up, we seem to do worse. So that didn't look like a good strategy. I kind of dropped that one. It didn't make sense anymore. So I just arrived at a place where I got really comfortable in my own skin. It was a deep, what I call a deep acceptance, not a superficial one, like a real deep acceptance of that how I was 100% perfect in every moment. I got really comfortable with myself. And as I did that, I got really comfortable with my kids and how they were showing up. It was like we were all on this journey as human beings, and there's no destination other than the one that we make up in our own minds. There's just a constant, rich learning experience. And every time that we kind of fall, it seems to be an opportunity to learn. And there was something about not showing up as our best selves didn't look like a problem. It just looked like a learning opportunity. It looked like part of life's ebb and flow. So because I had a whole new outlook on what it meant to show up as a human being, and that started with myself, what it meant for me to show up as a human being. And I found this more unconditional place to relate to myself. That just started to show up in my parenting, which of course my kids really appreciated because they were just doing the best they could. And it was hard on them when I felt they could do better or I wanted them to be different. So that really impacted them. So that was one of the real kind of ways in which I saw that as my relationship to myself changed, it changed for my kids too. And there were many, many others I can talk about that.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk more about parenting in a second, but first of all, would you say that all relationship problems then are a reflection of low self-esteem?
Well, you see, this is the way I see relationship problems. Because what's so interesting to me, Ankush, and I work with a lot of couples, right? And I work with couples who come in here to our center and literally can't stand each other. We can't even work with them in the same room to start with, right? Because they're so angry with each other. And when you separate them, all they try to do is convince us that how bad the other one is. You know, if you were married to him. What's so interesting to me is that when they start to speak about the reasoning, right, the justification about why the relationship's failing, why the marriage isn't working, and they give me examples of it, they start to tell me about a fight they had or a way their wife behaved or a way the husband behaved. And because I'm not kidding, it's like almost embarrassing because I've had like the exact same argument with my husband the previous night, like the exact same dynamics they're describing. It's happening and I know when I was working with a colleague of mine recently, we were almost looking at each other like feeling shameful, like, really? Like, yeah, we had the exact same interaction last night. So it's an interesting thing, but to me, what a healthy relationship is when you're able to connect with a person, again, at a much more fundamental level than the kind of dynamic that you're having between you. Because generally, you know, when we relate, and this was true for me again, bringing back to why it's always a relationship with yourself, I used to relate to myself through my thinking mind, like through what I thought about myself. So if I had a thought, you know, you really messed up there, I would be upset with myself. You know, you really messed up there. If I had a thought like, you know, you really are so boring, like who wants to hang out with you? And I'd feel all insecure and self-conscious in a group. Like I didn't realize I was having thought. Thought's invisible, right? So I had no idea that I was having a thought, and I just thought that was true. Because I was showing up within my own mind, I just thought, I am boring. I just thought, oh, I messed up there. It was almost as there was a truth that had nothing to do with me. When thought became visible to me, right, I suddenly saw this, like, I'm having a thought, and I'm creating some kind of truth out of that. The thought is just energy, you know, there's a lot of choice there that I have, you know. I don't have to believe every thought that I have about myself. When you don't know this, then you have no option but just to kind of live life as if whatever shows up in your mind is true. That's really tough because we have a lot of crazy thinking and a lot of insecure thinking that shows up in our minds, right? So that leads to a life where there's no stability, there's so much insecurity, there's so much dissatisfaction. Because I can tell you, if today I went through, if I kind of believed the thoughts that showed up in my mind this morning, I wouldn't be doing this interview now. But now it's kind of like, okay, you know, kind of turn the commentary down and let's get on with the day. It's not how I relate to life. It's not how I make up. It's not how my truth comes alive for me. You know, it's not through everything that goes through my mind. I have a different discriminator. So there's a way in which when I stopped listening to all the nonsense and noise in my head about myself, I immediately connected to something in me that was far more true and far more helpful. You know, I connected to kind of my innate common sense and my innate sense of compassion and forgiveness and insight and wisdom. I couldn't even connect to that before because I was just listening to all this kind of superficial noise in my head as if it was just life. Now that's the same in relationships. What I've seen is that how you connect to your kids or to, you know, to your partner or to your spouse, a good relationship is that there's a fundamental connection that's there. That's why you can meet someone and feel so connected to them and you know nothing about them. I married my husband after knowing him for 5 weeks. I knew nothing about him. You know, I really didn't. You could think I was irresponsible, but I connected to him in a really deep way. And then what starts to happen in a relationship, you start to think about the person and you start to believe what you think and you go with that as if that's true. So you think that if the other person is being insensitive, then they're insensitive, and that's true. And you go with that, and that kind of it kind of moves you further away from this kind of fundamental connection which lies underneath our thinking about the other person. And when we work with people, we try to get people to connect to this more fundamental feeling of connection, and to see that all the thoughts you have about the other person are just thoughts, and you can laugh at them and not take them seriously. And what's so interesting is people start to see that actually, when you take a lens and look at relationships, we all have the same stuff. But it's like, how seriously are you taking it? Like, how much does it actually matter that your husband didn't do what you wanted, or your wife did this, or how much does that actually matter? And you start to see that there's something that's much more fundamental. And if you're more interested in that, then all the other stuff just takes care of itself. You know, we get over upset. We get over people's insensitivities. We're able to do that. You know, we set up to be able to cope with people who are different to us, who have different perspectives, you know, we have the capability to be in a very, very dynamic relationship with a person who's completely different from us, if the focus isn't on our thinking about that, and we actually can just rest in this kind of deeper connection that we have as human beings, which again is unconditional, and it's not contingent on a person's behavior. And the fascinating thing, just to put one more aspect on it, which is that what we've seen is that people can be in a relationship with someone who, for example, is not behaving well. You know, we always have the examples of people saying, but what happens if somebody is abusive or not behaving well to me? And they can feel this feeling of connection, and they can actually feel this feeling of love for the person and still decide to leave the relationship. Because this feeling is fundamental, it has nothing to do, it's not contingent on the other person's behavior, they can still feel good about the person, but they can still make the decision to leave the relationship and feel the relationship is not working and, you know, we need out. So it's so interesting to me how this connection I've seen is so unconditional. It's just built into the human experience.
So I'd love to talk a little bit about parenting, because everything that you're saying sounds great, and you're actually living it, because you've got 5 teenage boys. Now I'm sure a lot of people would say that surely that would really show up if you're walking the talk, should we say. So can you talk about your relationship with your 5 teenage boys? Is that difficult? Do you get tested? You know, how does that work in relationship to what we're talking about?
I think everything that I've learned again, and the insight I've learned about state of mind and myself, has made parenting an absolute joy. You know, starting with the fact that one of the first things I learned about state of mind was that as a human being, we have all the resources we need to be able to deal with life. We have these thinking minds, and there's an intelligence behind these minds, which are much bigger than the experiences and the memories in the past that we've been through. It's kind of almost a universal intelligence that we have, that we can tap into. And as soon as I kind of got out of my own way, I started to realize how this mind of mine had actually been serving me. I started to actually realize, I saw in my life how it had been there for me and it had guided me. I hadn't been able to appreciate that before, even though I was living the benefits of my own kind of psychology and my own resilience, because it's innate. I was living the effects of it, but I couldn't really appreciate that because I had so much stuff in the way, so much noise in the way. You know, I had this narrative about myself that life was so difficult and I was so hopeless. So there's a way in which I, for myself, saw that we absolutely 100% set up to be able to deal with life. I really saw that and believed that and knew that was true. Now, I cannot begin to tell you how that affected my parenting, because when you have that knowing, it means that you don't have to worry about your kids. It means that your kids can have days when they struggle, when they're anxious, where they feel insecure, and you know that they're fine. You know that that's part of what we do as human beings. We get blown a little bit off course.
by our own kind of insecurities and thoughts and feelings. But you know that ultimately, when push comes to shove, there's a potential, and there's a deeper potential within us, this human spirit that I spoke, which has all these innate capacities and common sense, that we have what it takes to get through challenges. We have what it takes to deal with social situations where people don't always like us. You know, we know how to navigate that. So once I saw this was true for me, I knew this was true for my kids. So I didn't need to worry about them. I didn't need to be concerned or anxious, or I could just kind of parent them and enjoy their learning journey. And I can see that this has impacted my kids, because when my kids are destabilized, when my kids are struggling, when they're feeling insecure or they're feeling stressed, they can see that I'm not worried about them. They can see that I'm compassionate, because I know what it feels to be like that. It's a very human thing to kind of get insecure, and so that they can feel that I'm there for them, but they don't feel that I'm destabilized by them being destabilized. You know, they can see that there's a way in which I'm not buying into that. I'm like, you're going to be okay. And even if I'm not saying that, I'm feeling it and they're sensing it. So that has given them, I can see, a sense of their own confidence, of their own, like, yeah, we can do this thing called life. You know, we can. It's really, really, it's almost like, Ankush, it's interesting. I've seen that there's a deeper dialogue that's happening when we're parenting, that kids are picking up on. They're picking up on the feeling behind the words. They're picking up on, you know, your feeling about them in the world. You know, how capable do you think they are? You know, and to me, when I caught sight of my own potential, I felt like I was able to parent my kids' potential. You know, not their insecurities, not their limitations, because we all kind of have this thinking in the moment which limits us, right? So when my kids are feeling stressed because they've got exams, or they're feeling upset with one of their brothers, or they're going through, they're in this kind of limited groove of their own thinking, right? But beneath that, there's a whole world of kind of thought and ideas and insight available to them, which I know they're going to tap into as soon as they have like one moment of being distracted from whatever's on their minds, you know, that they're so committed to at that moment. I know that there's this kind of whole world of insight that they can draw from. So I parent to that. Like, that's what I parent to. That's what I speak to. That's what I see when I look at them. And what's so interesting to me, Ankush, is that how my parenting's changed is that I do very little intervention. So before, when you don't have trust and faith in another person, you feel like you've got to teach them, you've got to discipline them, you've got to show them, you've got to lecture them, you've got to keep on giving them something that they don't have, right? Now, it's true that I'm there to direct my kids and to offer kind of what I see and etc. But it's so much more gentle, because I've come to see that when I give my kids space, they self-correct. It's amazing. So I'll see my kids will show up in a certain way that's, you know, that's not great. They can be disrespectful or something. They have their moments. They're normal kids. And then I see that when I don't say anything, you know, when I give them a little bit of time, you know, with almost 100% of the time, especially now that they're older, they come back to me and they're like, Mom, I was just so intense earlier today. I was so overwhelmed. I'm really sorry. I don't know why I get like that, you know, and they have a conscience. They have this common sense and they see it for themselves. And as parents, we kind of think that our kids aren't going to see it. So we got to kind of keep on telling them, which just lowers their spirits, makes them feel awful about themselves, because they're anyhow already feeling awful, and it's not helpful. So I think that's really important. That's been very important in parenting for me and for my kids.
It's unbelievable, but we're at the end of time. You know, there's so much more that we could talk about. I'm sure we could have talked for another whole session, and maybe we'll get you back on again. But for today, thank you so much. I love so much of what you said today about your relationship to yourself, about humility. You know, your story was incredible, and even about seeing the wellness in your kids and parenting that was fantastic. So thank you so much for being on the show, Terry. If people want to get in contact with you, if they want to find out more about the Innate Health Center, they may want to come to one of your events, how might they do that?
Well, we've just launched a new website. So the web address is www.innatehealth.co. And my email address is also Terry, Terry, @innatehealth.co. So either of those two avenues should be a good start.
Fantastic. And people can get hold of me, as always, on my website, ankushjain.co.uk, which has links to all the various social media places that I'm on about, YouTube, Facebook, this podcast. Again, you can listen to on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. Thanks again, Terry, and I will meet the listeners virtually next time with another interviewee. Look forward to it. Thanks a lot. Thanks for listening to the Relationship Series podcast. If you want to hear more, you can click the subscribe button below. You can share this and impact someone else who can benefit, or you can like it and encourage others to listen. Also, it'd be great if you leave me a comment below, as I always love hearing from listeners and I want to keep creating great content for you. Thanks for listening.